Hello. In my last session, I looked specifically at how to book a sign language interpreter, just exploring the concept that one size doesn't fit all, specifically when it comes to interpreters' skill set. That they might have different skills in different areas. Now, today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at how you might use a sign language interpreter. How does that physically work? How might you then relate to them, but also to the deaf person that you're talking to? Now, this is quite a simple process. The deaf person would ordinarily bring an interpreter with them, or it may be booked through an agency. But whatever way you book an interpreter, this process is the same. So you would have a deaf person, there would be yourself interacting with the deaf person, and then an interpreter. Now, the interpreter would sit just by you or stand just by you, because then the interpreter would have eye line with the deaf person. So as you're speaking, the deaf person would maintain their eye contact with the interpreter. Now, this is quite valuable information for you because sometimes it can appear that the deaf person is not giving you any regard, that they're actually looking away from you towards the interpreter, but they're not being rude. It's just that they need to understand what you're saying. So they will look to the interpreter to see what's being said by virtue of that's being signed directly from the interpreter. But I would encourage you to maintain eye contact with the deaf person. Just keep looking at the deaf person. Don't just give your attention to the interpreter. Just as much as you would, if you were talking to a hearing friend, you would keep focused on them throughout that interaction. Now, if you're speaking, please don't turn to the interpreter and say, "Oh, could you just tell Simeon this? Or could you tell him that?" Speak as you normally would, as if you were addressing the deaf person directly. Just keep it as natural as possible, and the interpreter will aid that process. Now, occasionally, the interpreter, when working, might not quite understand what's been said. As part of the interpretation process, it might be some things just don't translate very well from language to language. And so the interpreter then therefore has a right just to pause and ask you for clarification. So they might say, can you just expand on that a little bit? Seek clarification that they need to support their interpretation into sign language and vice versa. That will just support the process. So a very simple process. Now, again, I'll just give you an example. It's a bit like if you had an English prime minister and a French prime minister or president, whatever that might be. They are using different languages. So they're using English and French in this example. And so you would have somebody who would be able to interpret between those two languages. So the English prime minister would use English. The interpreter would then speak that into French. The French president would speak back, and then that would be interpreted into English. Now, those two people during that interaction will maintain eye contact in order for them to be able to communicate with each other. And so I would encourage you to do the same thing. But the deaf person, what they will do is flick between you and the interpreter. So please don't feel just because they're looking away from you, it's a sense of rudeness. It's just that the deaf person needs to understand what you're saying through the interpreter. So it's a very simple process. Something else that's key for you to know is that when you're talking to a deaf person through an interpreter, you may just need to think physically where you're standing. So, for example, if you are stood with an interpreter and you have some light behind you beaming through a window, it's going to be impossible for the deaf person to see you. Because the light's coming from behind you. So it would be good, therefore, to move into the right position just to aid that process. Or if it's a dark room, you may just need to move to a better location, a brighter area where you can be seen more clearly. That just helps visually, just helps the deaf person focus on you and onto the interpreter. So again, a very simple process. So I'm hoping that this information has been helpful for you to understand how to use an interpreter. Thank you for watching. Farewell.